Testing. Bagels come first. Ein kemach, there's that phrase, ein kemach en Torah, kemach is flour.
Good evening. Good. All right, buddy.
Good morning, everybody. I hate to interrupt your pleasure. Yeah, I just love to hear the buzz in the room, though. I love it. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Great to see everybody. Welcome to those who are live streaming. Very glad to have you as well. Let's continue with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Lest you should be looking at me for the next 20 minutes wondering, what is different? What's different? So I can finally see all of you. Yeah. I'm sorry?
How does it look?
I'm inclined to say, but I suppressed it. That sometimes it's better not to see. But I did not want to say that. Forget I said that. Very good. Let's forget Torah and just talk about my glasses. As I said last night when Cantor Sebo noticed that I wasn't wearing these glasses, I described my visit to the ophthalmologist. And first, you get an eye test. And she gave me the eye test, and then she put the apparatus down, and she said to me, you shouldn't be driving. And I said, there are other ophthalmologists. But I could see that she was right, so here I am. I put it off for too long. You know how it is. We put these things off. And then finally we're confronted with the reality we cannot ignore. And these are progressives, and they take a while to get used to, in terms of reading and so on. But I'm glad to have them. I can see the signs much more clearly. The test for me was when we were in Chicago in February. I'd just gotten the glasses a couple of weeks before. And before that, I could not read the super titles for the opera. I had to squint, I had to open my eyes, and so on and so on. And then when I wore these glasses early in February at the opera, I could see perfectly. And so, that's the kind of confirmation that one needs. Okay, enough of that. Thank you to Doris Donnelly for sponsoring the bagels this morning, and to Maud Shaffron for sponsoring live stream and for picking up the bagels. You did both. You knew about live stream. You had forgotten that you picked up the bagels? Okay, very, very good. All right, so we are talking about humility. And last week we spent a good amount of time thinking about a variety of concepts, and then we began to look at different personalities. Abraham, and we looked at Moses. And what I'd like to do today is to move on with some other biblical passages and try to figure this issue of humanity out. Let me first offer some summary of what we did last week. It may not be everything, and maybe you'll want to add something to it. So the first idea about humility is the recognition that we're not at the top of the chain of being. We're not the most important thing in the universe. I read a long passage about Roger Federer, the great tennis player, who suffered some very significant losses. And the author summarized that by saying that humility represents a sense of our imperfections, of our losses, and so on. And I resisted that a little bit. I think that it is true that we don't always win, and certainly at the end we don't win at all. But the notion that humility is all about the humbling of us, that any pretension we have to being special is resisted by the notion of humbling. So that if we think of the ladder of being from the highest to the lowest, humility in that sense represents that we are low, that we lose, that we are imperfect, and so on. All this is true, but I think that it's overstated. And I think that we discovered when we talked about Abraham and Moses that both Abraham and Moses indicate that they are but dust and ashes. Abraham says so. And about Moses, it says he was not only humble, but very humble. But both of them also become active. Abraham argues on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah and challenges God. Shall not the just one of the universe not do just things? Which, when you think about it, is one of the most chutzpah things you can say. Don't you know who you are? You're a rabbi. Don't you know you have to be acting like a rabbi? You would think that somebody who has a certain attribute would try to act in accordance with the attribute. It's one thing to say it to one another. It's another thing to say it to God. Don't you know that it's being just for you is not a contingent matter. It's not a matter of choice. It's who you are. It's like asking a southpaw to throw right-handed. You're not built that way. And so Abraham, who says he's dust and ashes, also it strikes out very boldly against God. Now, one could say that God is inviting it by having the conversation with Abraham in the first place, and he wants to see what Abraham is made of. So one could say that it's a test of Abraham. But on the plain meaning of that dialogue is that this is a test of God by Abraham. And it's not anybody, any old person who says this to God. It's the one who said about himself, I'm dust and ashes. So this is a very different understanding of humility than the Roger Federer case. It's an example of one who recognizes that he or she is not the highest thing in the universe, that we are dust and ashes, both figuratively and literally, but that doesn't mean we're not to be active and bold. Humility is less a stance of littleness than a worldview. Here's where I am in the scheme of things, but that doesn't mean I can't activate my impulses and my values. And you remember that Moses, about whom it is said, as I've just said, that he is not only anav, humble, but anav ma'od, very humble. So the author is trying not to just make a throwaway comment, he's humble, but to get our attention that Moses is really a very humble person. And then, after God has said Moses is the most important person among the prophets there is, if I look at the category of prophets, those who receive revelations, there is a division within that category, two subsets. The first subset, why don't we take a look at it? Numbers chapter 11. Let's just view it for ourselves. Numbers chapter 12, I mean. Numbers chapter 12. Anybody have the page? 227. By the way, it's Miriam who is struck with leprosy and not Aaron. That may seem unjust to us and may be unjust. On the other hand, just to point this out, the very first word in chapter 12 in the Hebrew, Miriam and Aaron, in the English, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. But the Hebrew is, and Miriam spoke, and Aaron. That's literally. So the verb is in the feminine. It's not vayidaber, and he spoke, but vatidaber, she spoke. So the verb seems to apply only to her. But, since Aaron is represented as also speaking, I suppose the translation, though it hides that factor, is fair. They're both speaking, okay? But that may give us a clue as to the author's view of the justice of the punishment of Miriam alone. It's a fragile thread on which to base that distinction, but there it is, right there in the Hebrew, okay? So, verse 2. And they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us as well? Miriam is called a prophetess in the story of the splitting of the Red Sea. In other words, we're from the same family. You remember what Amos said. You might remember what Amos said when he's challenged by, who is it? Not Ahaziah, I can't remember. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. So what he might mean by that is there are two ways of being a prophet. You're called by God as an individual, or prophecy is the family business. Son of a prophet. And it's possible that Aaron and Miriam are under the impression that since they're brother and sister of a prophet, they're prophets too. I don't know that that's what they are implying, but it's plausible because there are the groups of prophets, and some of it must be inherited. So they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. Now, Moses was a very humble man, right? Anav ma'od mikol ha'adam, more so than any other person on earth. He's the humblest of people. He's Roger Federer on steroids. Roger Federer had a lot of victories, but he had some very important defeats, and they blemish his career. Yes, he's a humble person, but Moses is even lower than in terms of humility. But we'll see that humility here is not just defeat, more so than any man on earth. Suddenly the Lord called to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. So the three of them went out. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, stopped at the entrance of the tent, and called out Aaron and Miriam. The two of them came forward, and he said, hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision, and I speak to him in a dream, which I interpreted as a combination of two factors. Something given. A dream is something given to us, so a dream is a good metaphor, right? A vision might be something given. That's the revelation part. But they also are couched in the language of our own lives and our own experience. So that, as I pointed out, the difference, say, between Amos, who is a shepherd, who lives the life of a shepherd, and Isaiah, who is a city person. He's part of the employees, so to speak, of the temple in Jerusalem. So it's not accidental that Amos uses the language of pastoral life, and Isaiah uses the language of the city, because their message is a combination of what is given and what is part of them. So it's mixed. It's hard, isn't it, for us when we wake up in the morning, we've had a dream, to distinguish between the contingent, the adventitious part of what we have dreamt, and what really says something about us. It's hard to separate them. And that's what God is saying about prophets. All prophets except Moses. Verse 6 again, in the middle of the verse. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted. The word there is ne'eman, right? Ne'emanhu, faithful, loyal. He is the one who really can carry my words, because his loyalty is unmixed. That's my interpretation. Not so with my servant Moses. Notice, my servant. So to be a servant is to be lower than the one you serve. And it might be something of a synonym for humble, conventionally understood. So Moses, look, the highest thing the Bible can ever say about somebody is he is a servant of God. The highest thing, to serve something higher, is to be noble, not debased. Not so my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly, and not in riddles, or as I might add, visions or dreams. And he beholds the likeness of the Lord. Okay? So, as I pointed out last week, mouth to mouth has to be understood as different from mouth to ear. Mouth to ear is the way we speak to one another. I speak, you listen. Let's suppose I say something to Jackie, and Jackie passes it on to Flo. Mouth to ear to mouth. Jackie takes from the ear and then speaks it. And here is where misinterpretation can happen, in the transference from what I heard to what I say, and Flo hears something like what I said, but not precisely. It would be improbable that it's precise, and especially if Flo passes it on to Joan and so on, by the time it's gone from one person to five person, it's a different message. That's mouth to ear. Mouth to mouth is literal transference. What I speak doesn't go, it may go into Jackie's ear, but she recognizes the danger here and writes it down to be sure she gets it exactly, and what she speaks is what I have spoken literally. And that's very different from visions, dreams, or riddles. So, of course, this is the foundation document for the utter uniqueness of the 5 books of Moses. It's only the 5 books of Moses that give us God's very word. And we may not agree with that. But the Torah is trying to tell us that the Torah Moses is a stenographer passing on the very words he got. So that traditional idea that the Torah, the very words and letters that God spoke, has its justification right here, its warrant right here. The author is extremely careful about this. And so we know that when Moses leaves the scene, at this point we don't know exactly when it's going to be, Numbers 12, we don't know when, but whenever he leaves the scene, that unique kind of revelation, it's not that revelation stops, but the subsequent revelation is always mediated by our own situation. So once Moses dies, we have to close the first part of the Tanakh. And we know that Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. So the very next word after the end of Deuteronomy, Joshua chapter 1, has a different revelation status. It's no longer mouth to mouth. You see that? So here's the first thing to learn about Moses. He's extremely humble. He's the servant of God. He recognizes that he's not his own prophet. He's not the source of his own. He subordinates himself. That's humility. But look, as soon as it says he's a servant of God, his humility becomes transformed in terms of his uniqueness. Who else in the history of the world, this would be Judah Halevi's idea, rose to Moses' level? Nobody ever again got the literal word of God. Of course, Islam thinks that there is this literal communication with Muhammad, who was illiterate. And illiteracy, of course, is a very important component in being the transmitter of God's word, Allah's word. Because if you're illiterate, you don't have words of your own. And therefore, you're more likely to transfer what you heard. Other religions make the same kind of claim, that Jesus is the Son of God, that God emptied himself to give us Jesus, who through his... There's something very literal about that. The very acts, the empty tomb, the resurrection, right? The first revelation is at Shavuot, isn't it? What is Shavuot? Pentecost. That is in action, the analog to the literal word, isn't it? So different religions have different ways of making that the authority of the revelation very dramatic. So the humble man is the greatest man. That's the first thing. With him I speak, verse 8, mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and beholds the likeness of the Lord. Okay, that's a yabit. He sees God. Well, no man can see my face and live. So we have two very different ways of the Bible describes this. One, no man can see me and live. Jacob said he saw at the wrestling with the angel, I have seen the face of God. Here, Moses is represented as seeing God in some sense. You wouldn't be surprised that Maimonides thinks of this as intellectual seeing, not physical seeing. That Moses, according to Maimonides, who was both a great leader and a great philosopher, for Maimonides, Moses is Plato's philosopher king, who knows how to lead, has the rhetorical and leadership capacity as a leader, and also knows the truth. Of course he knows the truth. He got the word from God, the 5 books of Moses. So for Maimonides, Moses was able to link his mind with the divine mind, and that's a medieval idea. What's it called? Oh dear. There is this notion in the universe of the divine mind, not necessarily in God's mind, but right up there against the sphere below the moon. That's the earth. And the goal is to hook our mind to that mind of the universe. And that's what Maimonides said. So we can count on what Moses tells us because Moses had intimate connection with the divine mind. Interesting idea, isn't it? Okay. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses. Still incensed with them, the Lord departed. And the cloud withdrew from the tent. There was Miriam stricken with snow-white scales. When Aaron turned toward Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales. And Aaron said to Moses, O my Lord, account not to us the sin which we committed in our folly. Let her not be one as dead, who emerges from his mother's womb with half his flesh eaten away. This is what Aaron says to Moses. But then Moses, and this is the second way of understanding his humility, speaks directly to God, the first petitionary prayer in the Bible, the first bakashah. No, maybe not. There was, what's his name? Abraham's servant who goes north to get a wife for Isaac and says, please show me the right person. Anybody else have a petitionary prayer? Anyway, this is one of the first. How about that? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, O God, pray, heal her, in lovely, very terse Hebrew, al na rafana la. Okay, so Moses then, on behalf of Miriam, just as Abraham pleaded with God on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, heal her. So Moses' humility does not eventuate in utter passivity and self-abasement. I'm nothing. What can I say? Far from it. The humility is fully compatible with the active temper, both as the supreme prophet and as one who dares to ask God for a favor. Okay? So this is a very different view of humility than the Roger Federer kind of humility. And I like to think of, as I said a few minutes ago, that humility is a worldview. It is a way and an appropriate way of understanding us. We are little. Yeah? We come at some accidental moment. We're born at an accidental moment. We die at an accidental moment. Who knows when he or she is going to die? And as the book of Job tells us, one of the verses that I like the least in the Bible, that the worm covers us. So who are we really? And yet, see, that's the key idea, isn't it? And yet, we have a right to be active and bold even to God. Okay? So, the first summary moment is a recognition that we're not on top of the great chain of being. And we might think of this humility as an antidote to the corrosive effect of pride, of thinking of ourselves as larger than we are. And part of that is that humility becomes a prerequisite for the moral and spiritual life. If the moral life contains my obligations, and I have two kinds of obligations at least, obligations to myself, love your neighbor as yourself. The first idea there is that I have obligations to myself, to love myself. Or as I might say, how am I supposed to love my neighbor unless I first love myself? I have a right to love and respect myself and to care about my own well-being. Mindfulness is a big idea these days. And this is a kind of a justification, or another justification, for taking care of myself. Because the Bible tells us here, first and foremost, you have to love yourself. How am I supposed to love somebody else if I'm filled with resentment and anger? I have to accept myself in order to be able to accept others. But the moral life also requires that I reach out beyond myself to help others. This is part of my humility. I have responsibility. So another component or implication of humility is responsibility. that since I'm not the highest thing in the universe, and therefore only I count, others count too. And if others count too, I have responsibility to do what I can to help them lead the kind of life I want for myself. So here humility has complex connotations. It's not just I'm the lowest of the low. Okay? The well-being of others, responsibility, Moses, heal her, and so on. So here's the paradox. Our littleness doesn't diminish us, it emboldens us. Or let me say that again better. Our littleness both diminishes and emboldens us. It keeps us from arrogance. And in that sense, I've got to recognize the sun doesn't rise on my well-being. It rises for all of us. So yes, I am small in many real ways, but that smallness does not compromise my capacity for responsibility, response to need, and my being willing to be courageous over and against certain felt responsibilities. Okay. So the final thing by way of summary is this idea that we looked at last week, that the humble spirit is equivalent to all the offerings in the temple. So there introduces the religious idea, the spiritual idea. There's the moral component of humility, and there's the spiritual, that I am needy, and that the God of the Bible, the God that we believe in, responds to our needs and has supplied us with certain things. Otherwise, we wouldn't say the Shechianu, thank you for today, or all the prayers of praise, which are an acknowledgement that I'm not the maker of my own well-being, or not the sole maker of my own well-being. Okay, so any other thoughts about what we talked about last week or otherwise, Ron?
I'm somewhat puzzled by the 12, 11 paragraph. Aaron does not beseech God to cure Mary.
Yeah.
And indeed, he turns to Moses and refers to Moses as his Lord, which Moses would decry. And asks Moses directly to effectuate the cure. He doesn't ask Moses to intercede on behalf of Miriam by asking God. And I'm puzzled by why the author would have gone that way.
Interesting. So verse 11, and Aaron of chapter 12 said to Moses, "O my Lord," that's the first thing, Ron, you pointed to. Where are we here? El Moshe, be Adoni, okay, Adoni, my Lord. There's always the problem for the translator to wonder, this is very key in the whole story of those three men, mysterious men who come to visit Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. We know Abraham sees them only as human beings. We come to see that they're messengers of God, or that in their presence is God's presence. And at one point, Abraham says, "Oh, my lords," and that can be vocalized. In other words, Hebrew, as you know, is a combination of consonants and vowels. And the vowels are not on the same line as the letters. They're below the letters or above it. So Adon is Lord. And it can be vocalized in three ways. Adoni, my Lord. Adonai, with this vowel called a patach, which means my Lord's plural. Adoni, my Lord. Adoni, my Lord. Adonai, with a patach, that line. My Lord's. and Adonai, Ashkenazic, with the kamatz, this vowel. Adoni is secular, my Lord. Adonai, with the patach, is my Lord, secular. Adonai is God. So which one is it? And the Torah doesn't tell us. And we might say, come on, these are three men, so it's definitely secular. But no, we come to see that God is involved in this visit. So maybe it should be my Lord God. See, so there's controversy among the interpreters about what it should be. So what am I driving at here? So there's something lovely and ambiguous about what Hebrew can enable, because the Torah scroll is only a consonantal text. There are no vowels. There are hints of vowels. The hey at the end shows us that the vowel before it has to be an ah or an aw or sometimes an eh. Otherwise, it's a consonantal text. So look. So now I'm back to verse 11 of chapter 12. And Aaron said to Moses, "Oh, my Lord." Now, there's no ambiguity here. This is the secular individual. And it's vocalized Adoni. If you have the Hebrew text, you can see it's vocal. The vowels were put in hundreds of years after the biblical text was fixed. Let's say the biblical text was fixed in about, 150 of the Common Era. You may know the Dead Sea Scrolls has no sanctified text. It has texts. And there's a mixture of texts that became Bible and texts that didn't become Bible. And they're written in different languages. Primitive Hebrew, a little more modern Hebrew for that day, Greek, some Aramaic, I think, because according to Frank Cross, who is one of the big scholars of this whole thing, there are different traditions represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Babylonian tradition, a Jerusalem, Israel tradition, and a Greek tradition. The Egyptian, the Septuagint is in Greek. So, and they're all mixed together in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we just know at that point, canon, the distinction between those texts that are sacred and those texts are not, had not been fully completed. So the earliest that we have a fixed text is maybe 100 of the Common Era. The Qumran community was destroyed in 70 when the Roman Wars. But it wasn't for hundreds of years after that vowels were definitively placed in the text. That's what the Masoretes did in the 8th and the 9th century. So that for hundreds of years, these texts went unvocalized. And the Masoretes had to make a decision, saying the word Adon, Adoni, Adonai, Adonai. I'm speaking Ashkenazic here, because the Sephardic pronunciation is the ah and the aw are just the ah. That distinction. My father used to say the Kaddish, Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadal v'Yikada Shemera. Baruch atah Adonai. We say Baruch atah, even though it's a kamatz. It's the T vowel, so to speak. That's how it looks. What are we driving at here? So this is Ron's point about he dresses Moses, oh my Lord. Everything I've said in the last 10 minutes is a digression. But digressions often turn out to be the main thing, don't they? Oh my Lord, account not to us the sin which we commit in our folly. Let her not be as one dead who emerges from his mother's womb. So he pleads to Moses, not to God. Is that all? Is that your point? Is that your question?
That's puzzling to me. Because he is the author ascribing to Moses a power.
Certainly a singularity, right? That he's the one. It's not made explicit, as so much is made explicit, right? He's the most faithful in my house. That's explicit. But why Moses gets to plead to God and Aaron doesn't isn't made explicit. But it's implicit because Moses has already been singled out. Does that solve the problem? Oh, very.
Well, I just said, there seems to be an ascription of power to Moses, that Moses does not specifically deny or decry. He doesn't act on it directly, he acts on it by petitioning God. But he doesn't say, hey, whoa, I can't do this, but I know the guy that can.
Who, Aaron says this?
Moses doesn't say that.
I know the guy who can. Who is the guy who can?
God.
Oh,
Moses doesn't, Moses does not
I see what you're saying.
disabuse Aaron of the attribution of power. He doesn't say, I repeat myself, I can't heal her, but God can, and I can ask God to do it. He doesn't say that. He just goes on and asks God.
So your point is that Moses, I didn't see what you were saying up until this point, that Moses doesn't explicitly tell Aaron, I can't do this.
Correct. I don't have this power.
And I thought part of your point was, and you don't either, Aaron. Was that part of your point? No. It could be. What's at stake there? He doesn't tell Aaron. He doesn't tell Aaron because why rub it in?
It just seems that it's unusual that the author permits the suggestion of power in Moses that Moses does not possess.
That Moses
doesn't.
Moses doesn't possess? Oh, because Aaron says to Moses, you do it.
You do it.
I guess I'm not following you. Aaron says to Moses, you do it, and Moses doesn't say to Aaron, I can't do it.
That's correct. But my question isn't why, a derivative question is why doesn't he say I can't do it? The main question is why did the author suggest that Moses could do it?
So let me offer an analogy from a very remote area, and that is baseball. So you may remember Johnny Mize. Johnny Mize played for the Giants for many years, and then he was traded to the Yankees and became pinch hitter. And he was a pinch hitter extraordinaire. He got an unusual amount of hits for a pinch hitter who really is sitting on the bench the whole game and then is called upon to get up there and do something significant. Johnny Mize could do it. The next time the need arose, who would the manager pick? It's Johnny Mize, because Johnny Mize has already shown himself to be the one who can do it. What does chapter 12 tell us up to this point? Moses is the guy who can do stuff. And therefore, the author assumes that Moses is the guy, and that's why he doesn't bother saying Moses is the guy, because it's already been made clear. Moses is the Johnny Mize of ancient Israel. There was also Tommy Henrik. You remember Tommy Henrik, who was the same thing? Yankees always got these guys late in their career who rose from the ashes like the phoenix and did great things. So that's a very interesting question, because the author buys it. He drinks the Kool-Aid, the Moses Kool-Aid, so to speak, and doesn't have to again say why it's Moses. Gary?
This discussion's been very interesting, and I'm curious about how you would apply the concept of humility to today's world, where we see people who are, for example, activists in one way or another, and even people who have narcissism. Can those people really claim to be humble?
It's a balance, isn't it? I mean, we think of narcissism as a pathology, but the positive understanding of what narcissism articulates, the positive part of that is self-respect. And saying to myself, my ideas, they're not the only ideas in the world, but they matter. I've thought about it. I have a right to say there's some substance and value in my ideas. If I move to the next step and only my ideas, now I'm narcissistic. So wouldn't humility in the modern world be what it always is? There's humility and there's humility. Humility sub A is the Roger Federer thing. Not Roger Federer himself, but what the author implies in that little piece. Humility sub B is positive, a humility that is not merely self-abasement, self-belittlement. And we could think of a lot of people who express their ideas as boldly as they think they deserve and maybe persist, but also are willing to step back and listen to somebody else and not assume that my ideas, because they're mine, are the only ideas. I often make this distinction between objective certainty and subjective certainty. It's Kierkegaard's idea. Objective certainty is, I believe that X is true, not just for me, but for everyone. Subjective certainty is, X is true for me, and I'm not claiming that it's true for everyone. There are different truths. And that seems to me to be a prerequisite for pluralism in the modern world. Not that what I care about and believe is not a value. It's a huge value for me and for my community. But I'm not trying to say it's the only way of living a life. Wouldn't that be humility in the modern world? Boldness and reticence. Yeah. Eddie?
Going back to
Well,
the Aaron conundrum, I believe, based on or could it be based on the text, that he's actually showing some humility, because the whole thing was, we are the same as Moses. And Miriam gets struck, and he's like, uh-oh, we're not. So he's like asking forgiveness from Moses, and then Moses shows him, hey, I'm not the guy, but I can go ahead and intercede for you before God.
I like that. So Aaron already has been shown his place, and he accepts it. And that's why he appeals to Moses, who appeals to God. Oh, I think we've arrived at something very interesting here that never occurred to me, that the relative place in the hierarchy has been established by the author and recognized by the protagonists. On the highest level is God and God alone. On the next level is Moses and Moses alone. And on the next level are still very important people, Aaron and Miriam, who defer to Moses, who defers to God. Love it. And Moses is also not the oldest child. He's the youngest. So this is also a continued, I might say, assault on the notion of the absolute right of the firstborn, which the Bible is intent on. Linda, Maya. Linda, I know, but do I have your name right? Lynn.
I wanted you to answer her question.
I was about to do it. I'm often accused of not looking to my left.
Just to reinforce what Eddie said, I think that at the beginning of the chapter, it's God that establishes that Moses is his top man. And then following Aaron, because it comes from up, now it comes from down. So Aaron now recognizes that indeed Moses, Aaron.
I like that. And that has something to do with the idea of leadership. True leadership has to be acknowledged both from above and from below. I mean, if you think God calls you, let's just speak biblically here, that's one thing, but if the people will not acknowledge your leadership, this is what I mean by acknowledgement from below, you can say all you want, God called me, but if people aren't following, then your leadership is vacuous. So there's a theory of leadership there too. And let's think about this for a minute. Let's suppose now we have a theory of leadership in Numbers 12. God's on the top, Moses is next, and everybody else, Aaron and Miriam. If we didn't have Aaron and Miriam acknowledging it, this would be a partial view of effective leadership. In a way, Aaron and Miriam, or especially Aaron here, by acknowledging Moses' leadership, is representing, that's the leap I'm making, something about the people over and against the leader. Malcolm?
I wanted to dissect a little further the distinction I think Gary was making or asking about between activism and narcissism. To me, there's a, and it tying back to this term of humility, there is, I think you suggested that there is a self-respect that is part of, that's inherent in that. But I think narcissism is more self-admiration.
Okay.
And so activism is part of that respect, and going into this text, there is some responsibility for me to act. But again, as Gary sets it up, I think narcissism is a different branch or a different path.
It's self-respect taken to an extreme. I mean, when you think of, I think I've just said this, that responsibility has the word response in it. And a response is an acknowledgement of somebody else's something. Because if I'm responding to something that has already been presented to me. And so I'm not the maker of all meaning. Others make meaning, and I have a responsibility to respond. So making room for another. Narcissism would seem to be egotism without anything else, or something like that. Tell me your name again, please.
My name is Tanya.
Tanya.
Yes.
I'm going to try to remember.
So I'll speak out of wisdom. If I hear my friend Carol, let's say she's sick, and just like Aaron has asked Moses for something for Miriam, I come and I know that she's sick, but I ask you as a leader, as a rabbi, can you pray to Hashem so she can be healed?
Yes.
That's taking away from myself, humbling myself, coming in honor of her, and then removing narcissism because I was just egotistical, but allowing Hashem to answer through you because you are a rabbi, you are our leader, an MVP.
So I'm trying to recall my responsibility to live streamers. Shall I review all the comments that I made?
Yes, sir.
So Tanya is saying that this is not only responsibility but wisdom, in the sense that you recognize who is able to deal with this situation in his or her own way. You have the capacity to reach out because you care about Carol, so that's your responsibility. It's not that you're without it. You point to me because you think that the rabbi can do something you can't do. You could, of course, appeal to God, but you're implying that somehow the rabbi's channel is a little more direct, something like that. And that's a piece of wisdom, too. You recognize who is capable of doing what. I wouldn't ask Sam Zoldak to pinch hit. I asked Johnny Mize. But also you recognize, or hope that I recognize, that I'm not the healer. I am a person who has to call on somebody else, because if you call me and I say, I'll be right over, and I come over and lay my hands on her head, I've misunderstood who I am. So that's very good. Each of us has a responsibility, and to acknowledge that responsibility, which is a reality principle, it's real, is wisdom. Is wisdom. I like that. Joan, come on, Joan.
I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me, in noticing people who are narcissistic, that it arises out of a lack of confidence in oneself, a lack of good feeling. And it appears in a different way. It comes out in a
I
different
thought you said you weren't a psychologist. Yeah. No, that's a very rich observation. And I don't know if any of us is capable of really wrestling it to the ground, but Joan is suggesting that sometimes the assertion of X can be an acknowledgement of not X. If I assert myself as an authority, the authority, that would seem to be excessive. Anybody should know I'm not the only one. And if you say you're the only one or act that way, you must feel that maybe you're not even worthy, and so you're going too far in asserting your own power. I think that's very good. Right, that's very good. I like that. Vivian?
I was just going to piggyback a little on Tanya's comment, and back to the idea of the activist leader. The effective leader is also able to heal. I mean, the sandwich in these two lines is please heal. So an effective leader is also either able to establish some order or healing.
You being metaphorical?
I guess I'm being metaphorical, yeah. I mean, I love that there's no space between those two, the entry and then Moses's request.
The entry?
Well, oh my Lord, Aaron saying to Moses,
Mhm.
and then Moses's response.
So Vivian is saying that in terms of Tanya's model, that the leader, in this case, the leader ought to recognize that he's not the one who heals. But you're raising the possibility that the leader also heals in a way, and you're pointing to the lack of any space between what Aaron says and Moses' response, as if Moses recognizes right away that he has a real role here and that he's not just a cipher through which the message goes to God.
Healing or order is an attribute of an active leader.
That's very nice. Healing, in quotes,
Right.
that the leader can help to heal the community, so to speak, or the situation, by bringing order and maybe some other things. I like that a lot. In a way, we call that charisma, don't we? I mean, charisma, I think, comes from the Greek that means a gift, something given. And when we see charisma, we recognize it as a quality that's hard to isolate or fully understand. It's as if there's something mysterious about the power of certain individuals just in expressing themselves that has an impact on others. Right, and your point here is that leaders have that charism, that at best, not all purported leaders have it, but probably Warren G. Harding or Millard Fillmore, remember Millard Fillmore, had no charisma. James Buchanan.
Charisma for
There you go. I love that. It's like any power that it's value neutral, can be used for good or not for good. Now, that's very true. I guess the most dangerous people are the ones with charisma, but with the wrong values, something like that. So up to this point, this has been the 5-minute introduction. Scott?
This is just a quick question for anyone who's psychology literate or a psychologist. Is narcissism a conscious decision, a subconscious condition, or a combination of both? And the reason it would be important is if it's not, then the recognition would be impossible. The recognition would preclude narcissism. It would mean that you were self-aware of this condition, if it's purely subconscious. If it's not, that's my question. Is it?
Boy, I don't know. I'm sure we're talking about thousands of dollars of psychotherapy to answer your question. But I could certainly see somebody well aware of his or her narcissism and feeling it's wholly justified, and therefore being aware of it and celebrating it. Although, as Joan points out, the sources of it, I mean, so any aberration, how do we define aberration? That's the question. I don't want to assume it. Requires some unpacking, and maybe psychoanalysis is one way, and, maybe reflection. What people do is they go away on retreats for a week or two of silence. And it's a time really to allow yourself to, meditation is a way of sort of emptying yourself so that the reality can come through. There are a variety of ways of doing it. Nancy.
Narcissism is a personality trait, and therefore it's terrible. We're born with a personality. It's also affected by nature, by the ways in which we're raised and grown up. But I wanted to piggyback on what you were saying before. Narcissism is a dimension. It's a range. There's healthy narcissism. We all strive for healthy narcissism. It's a degree of self-respect and a feeling that we have something to offer and confidence about who we are. And then there's pathological narcissism, and I think that's what you were asking about before, the pathologic narcissistic personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what somebody was asking?
Yeah, that's what, I mean, I think you're presuming, excuse me, as do I, that narcissism is a negative term, that it's the aberration. You're saying that narcissism is a mere description for some sort of self-regard, which can be healthy, it can be unhealthy.
Yeah, and we all follow along that.
Along that continuum. Yeah, good, that's clarifying. And you're talking about the technical language of psychology. Yeah. Who hasn't spoken yet? Cindy?
Hello. If I'm not, only for myself.
What am I?
The thing that he's talking about, unhealthy narcissism and healthy narcissism, because it allows us to have regard for other people as well.
Very good, very good. So Cindy is, in a way, redescribing Nancy's point, that I can be for myself, and one could call that a kind of narcissism. I find that, I mean, you're the expert on this, on the language, but it's always struck me that narcissism is, but nevertheless, there's, just to use the language you've proposed, there's healthy narcissism and there's If I'm not for myself, I don't have enough self-regard or enough narcissism. If I'm only for myself, I'm too narcissistic. So I get it along that continuum. Let's move on a little bit if we could. So I want to look at two more passages together. The first is, and they're both from Deuteronomy chapter 8. 287. That's an example of the answer preceding the question. 287 is chapter 8 Okay, very good. Okay. Chapter 8, verse 11.
That's on 288.
Okay, very good. Verse 11. So Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell address, and he is warning the people about what might befall them and trying to prepare them. So he says here, take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments, his rules, and his laws, which I enjoin upon you today. And so Moses is pointing to the possibility of forgetting what God has done. And what he's going to point to here is one of the vehicles of forgetting is excessive self-regard. So this is an example of the issue of humility. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered, these are things which require activity, and I could attribute them to myself. I've eaten my fill because I've been a good farmer. And I've cared for my crops, and I understand weather conditions, and I've done all the right things. And have built fine houses to live in. Who else builds our houses but us or our agents? And your herds and flocks have multiplied. Well, of course they've multiplied. I know how to manage them. And your silver and your gold have increased. You know, I've put money in my bank account every single week, every month, every year, and my silver and gold have increased because I've done good things. And everything you own has prospered. So in other words, what the examples are not things that either are clearly done by others or accidents that have happened to me. These are things, the agent for which is plausibly me. And includes me. I'm not out of the picture here. I have helped to do these things. God didn't build my house. Believe me, I'll come to the empty lot at which they're bringing materials for the house to be built. And I've watched the process from nothing to the house. And believe me, I never saw God's hand at work. This is all human beings, particularly me, because I'm the one who authorized it, if not actually done the work, okay? So the author is, I think, quite cleverly pointing to things for which I could praise myself legitimately, because I've done the work. Beware, verse 14, lest your heart grow haughty. Who built the house? Me. Who else built the house? Nobody. Just me and my agents. I've done this. I've done it well. I've done it really well. The house stands. The house is beautiful. The rooms are well proportioned. I did the blueprint. I'm good at I am good at this. So haughtiness is something that is easy to occur. It's the notion, I think, of legitimate self-praise and illegitimate self-praise. Wherein does praise for my efforts end and haughtiness begin, is the question. Because this is not an example of just making it up, right? I go to my street, I see the house on the corner, and I say, I built it, when I had nothing to do with it. But I talked to my neighbor, I said to my neighbor, do this, it's all me. So it's not a matter of any kind of self-praise is haughtiness. But given the legitimacy of human agency, Where does my assessment of my role begin to be illegitimate? So beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt. Now, so here's the transition from regarding praising myself for what I actually did and forgetting when I build that house, I can say, I had a big part in it. But I need to remember that God freed me from Egypt. Really? God freed me from Egypt is a way of seeing myself realistically as both capable and the limits of my capability, the freeing from Egypt? That the Lord your God freed you from Egypt, the house of bondage, and led you through the great and terrible wilderness with serpents and scorpions, a parched land with no water in it. I wasn't on that trip. That happened a long time ago. What does that have to do with me, is the question here, it seems to me, with no water in it. Who brought forth water for you from the flinty rock. That's a great story. I wasn't there. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers have never known, in order to test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. So this is a test. I built the house. I can take credit for it. I deserve credit for it. I can be haughty about it. I can have excessive regard for myself. And this is a test, not just for these guys back here in Deuteronomy, but for all of us, right? This has existential implications. To test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. That's why there were so many hardships in the wilderness, is a test. And you say to yourself, see, notice the dash, at least in my thing, because we have to go way back to 14. Beware lest your heart grow haughty, and here's why you shouldn't. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. Remember, it's the Lord your God who gives you the power to get wealth in fulfillment of the covenant that he made on the covenant? Why are you bringing the covenant in here? The covenant that he made on oath with your fathers, as is still the case. If you do forget the Lord your God and follow other gods to serve them, I'm going to define who other gods are, just arbitrarily. Ourselves. All idolatry can be understood as narcissism because the idols are made in our image, and therefore they're projections of ourselves. So idolatry is self-worship, or it's the highest kind of self-worship. Okay? So this is haughtiness, this is pride, which is the opposite of humility. If you do forget the Lord your God and follow other gods to serve them or bow down to them, I warn you this day that you shall certainly perish. And I take it that perish, now it's a corporate thing, so the community will perish. Because I said I built this house, and I'm extremely proud of it. Not only am I extremely proud of it, I alone did it. I'm going to perish? Something calamitous is going to happen to me? It's not you're going to die. We all know we're going to die. But that some untoward consequence is going to befall you. Really. Like the nations that the Lord will cause to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you didn't heed the Lord your God. So, what is this all about? It's a very powerful thing because, as we've noticed in the Moses chapter, self-regard, self-praise, acknowledgement of agency and the value of my agency is a good thing. And it can be compatible with humility. So that's the model I'm presenting here as an interpretation of this. What's wrong here? What's the guy pointing to? Stuart?
Isn't this an example of hubris, overweening pride,
Okay.
arrogance?
Okay, so yes, so Stuart is suggesting this is hubris, this is arrogance, overweening pride, to give myself more credit than I deserve. The question is, I think, one of the questions is, what are the examples of what God did for me that should sober me to recognize that God has a role in this, or at least I'm not all powerful? So there are two questions here. Should I accord to myself full causality? And I think the answer is no. We get that. But what is it that I do have to acknowledge? In general, that there are other forces, other causes that have made possible the felicities of my life. Okay, very good. Free from Egypt, wandering in the desert, covenant. How are those good examples? Are they just metaphors for the things that happen to us, or are they more than that? It's true I didn't wander in the desert, but I think it's not just true that they're mere metaphors. I think something else is at work here. Patty?
I can think of something that's much more concrete, an analogy to living in the United States specifically, that when you hear arguments against reparations for African Americans, most of those arguments are based in, I worked really hard for everything that I have and I deserve the praise and the wealth that I have. But in a very concrete sense, our whole economy was based on enslaved people and their efforts to establish just about everything that we generate wealth with in this particular country. And it's easier for me to think of that example than to think of God's work leading people through the desert and providing water and manna. It's much more concrete and not as ephemeral, where God's role has led me to a place where I should really appreciate God's efforts and what I have today versus what I worked really hard in getting to law school and raising my children and saving money. And that doesn't, that's not as easy for me to do as the first example.
So Patty's point, and I like it very much, is that whatever we accomplish is built upon what you're calling, what I'm calling in your name here, conditions for the possibility of those achievements. And in this sense, I think that's what the author is driving at with redeeming from the land of Egypt. These are conditions for the possibility of what we have. I would say not necessarily the episode itself, but the very idea of freedom, the very idea of being freed from those conditions which shrivel our capacities. In a way, I'm going to say it anyway. I'm having a little argument with myself, should I say it? That's so far one side has won. And now just for those of you who enjoy reading Immanuel Kant, See, Kant is interested in something that most philosophers are not. The conditions for the possibility of knowledge or morality. What makes it possible? That's what's called his transcendental philosophy. So he's interested in laying the foundations for the possibility of knowledge, of morality, of aesthetics. And that's what you've done. The conditions that make it possible. And I want to suggest, and here I'm going to appeal to another person we all love, and that is none other than Aristotle. Aristotle thinks of potentialities as a first actuality. That which makes other things possible is itself real. So I think that what's going on here is that the author is engaged in a highfalutin way, I'm going to call, a transcendental argument. What are the conditions that make possible my achievements? Which doesn't eliminate my role in my achievements, but I have to recognize that there are conditions in the world into which I come, which are there, and without which I couldn't do my part. And therefore, God is represented by the conditions of the natural world, let's say, or the historical continuum that I cannot ignore in acknowledging who's responsible, right? So the sufferings in the wilderness, let's just use them as a metaphor, the impediments that stand in our way, which need to be clearing away, illness, the capacity of the human body to heal itself, the capacity of others to help the healing, the capacity of a culture to develop physicians and treatments and cures, these are all actualizations of the possibility that makes them happen. And it's a mistake to focus only on our actualizing and not recognize that the possibility of actualizing depends upon conditions, potentialities, which have always existed. A potentiality, that which hasn't been actualized yet, can be redescribed as a condition, which is there to be actualized. And if we went back and we asked ourselves, now what are these things? God freed us, freedom. We were tested. There was no water, and then water. Hey, wait a minute. There's only drought. That's the condition. And then water. Drought is only temporary because there is water. And yeah, if there is water is not enough. I can only have crops if I then utilize the water, create a hose. So the actualization, so I think the pride element here is to focus on the actualization and not recognize the potential that makes it possible. And by the way, in the Hebrew here, in verse 17, and you say in your heart, kochi, koach, we know the word koach, koach, strength, right? Kochi, my strength, va'otzam yadi, and the forcefulness of my own hand. That's it. That's to recognize me and only me as the agent for the actualization, whereas I'm dependent on something that is laid there before me. I think of this as God's work in the world, creating the possibilities, the conditions, on the basis of which I bring to realization what is there waiting for me. By the way, the word koach, strength, is one of the definitions of Aristotle's word dunamis for potentiality. It is a kind of power, although it just lays there waiting to be brought to life. It's already a power. There are two powers at work: mine and the conditions that make the implementation of my power possible. I think this is an extraordinary passage which really recognizes two kinds of contributions to what I do, one of which is me. So if it were only God, then that would be Roger Federer humility. I'm nothing. God gives me everything. But this says, no, I do stuff. Because the things that are happening here are building houses and filling crops, and the author must know that I play a role in that. So Maya, and then Tanya.
I think the fascinating thing about this is if you don't remember the past, you won't have a future.
Now temporally, I've argued in terms of spatially. Now you're adding temporally to it. And the past, in just using this language, is a condition for the possibility of what we do. And what's the great quote by George Santayana? The person who forgets the past is doomed to repeat it. So the past tells us what's possible, or at least it tells us to look out, not to ignore what has happened, and which gives us something of the parameters of the possible. Good. Time and space. Time and space. Tanya?
Allow me to speak to wisdom. And now I'll give you an example. I believe right now we are in the stage of being in wilderness.
Of being
In wilderness.
in the wilderness.
Because we are still not free in Israel.
Ah.
We are still at war. So we have to depend on Hashem to get us through that wilderness. Right now we are in the stage of wilderness, no different from when Moses was in the wilderness with all the Israelites.
Okay.
Now,
So,
we don't depend on ourselves to bring our own wealth, but we depend on Hashem. So we have to humble ourselves, just like Hashem is very humble.
So Tanya is reframing this in religious terms. That, let's say, is in Israel, one could understand the condition now of being in a wilderness. And just as the wilderness was not successfully managed on human action alone, it depended on God, so you're saying by analogy that we have to pray to God to give us the possibility of getting out of that wilderness. One could extend this, just to be a little political about it. Maybe part of the wilderness in which the people in Israel live is that the Palestinian issue has not been resolved. And that therefore, every 3 years until it is resolved, there's going to be another war. So I would say that you've given one possible interpretation to this, a theological one. And I'm not going to say that's not true. But there is another one that I think is implied here, though the theological is everywhere at work here. I think one can extract from this passage something secular, or something religious in a naturalistic way. You may know that Spinoza, one of the great creative forces in the history of humanity, I mean, Spinoza dared to say stuff that nobody was saying. He was excommunicated by the Jewish community, didn't bother him. In a way, Spinoza is the first secular Jew, in the sense that he maintained his connection, his Jewish thoughts, but didn't, by leaving Judaism, join Christianity. That's what converts often did. They joined another religion. Spinoza was satisfied not being part of a religious community. And Spinoza's great dictum is natura, God, or nature. that really one finds God in nature and not transcending nature. And that's the argument I'm promoting here, that there is a view of God as represented by the conditions in nature and in us that make activation possible. We come into the world where there are certain conditions already at work. I like to call them gifts. These are the gifts. My mind, my eyes to see, my hands to reach out, my heart to feel. I didn't create these things. These are the conditions that are just sitting there for me to actualize. So I think another way of saying this is human beings have the capacity to recognize what's possible and to use what's possible and to make, let's say, some peace with the Palestinians, some way out of this war without appealing to God, but not just saying that we ourselves alone can do it. We have to recognize what's possible. And what's possible is the first actuality. Possibility is not just potential, it's also a kind of actualization, which I have to bring to the second actualization. My mind is the condition for the possibility of thinking. The thinking is something I do. The possibility to think is something I didn't do. And that is give me a mind, which is already an act. That's the point. Potentiality is not just nothing, it's a something, which then becomes a condition. I think this passage is extremely rich, which, as Tanya points out, can be given different readings, different interpretations. You've given one of them. I've suggested another one, which I take it as theological, frankly, because I think that the idea of God can be understood in what's given to me, that I didn't create for myself. It acknowledges autonomy, but autonomy based in what is already there. And what is there as a gift, I'm not implying a giver from the gift, but the gift certainly has to be recognized for the richness that our world makes possible for us. Ron.
I think this whole thing argues for the proposition that we can never forget that God was the prime mover.
Uh-huh. Okay. At base, and when all things are said and done, there is God. Okay. Yeah, that's a religious way of understanding the world in which we live. And, the language, the God language of religion is, even for those of us who don't take it fully, literally as the Bible has it, is still extremely potent, both in terms of content and in terms of form. That is, it's a concrete way of understanding the foundations of our reality. I want to, Candy.
This conversation makes me think we're playing a game of chess, and I just need to think ahead far enough, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 moves, which I can never do, and I'm a terrible chess.
I like that.
So it's somewhat disheartening to hear that, and then it leads me to whether or not all of this is preordained.
Oh.
Do you think God is sitting up there putting these stumbling blocks in our path and wondering whether or not we can find a way to overcome them or go around them or move through them or use our possibilities to be successful? Is it preordained? It doesn't necessarily seem like it's not aimed in the way of peace or tranquility or positive.
Look, there are different forms of determinism. Determinism is things are determined already.
Right.
Think of the game of chess. Certain things are predetermined. The rook can only move a certain way. We know what an end game move is. So it's rule bound, and those rules precede the game. In this sense, the game is determined. But nobody thinks that it's fully determined, because not only do I have the freedom to move in certain ways, the very rules which determine the game are the conditions for the freedom that I have to move. If there were no rules, what would I do? I would take the knight and I would go diagonally. And you would say, I don't understand that move. What should I understand by that? And I would say, I don't know either. There are no rules. I'm totally free. I'm going to move diagonally. And therefore, full freedom paralyzes. It's only when certain things are determined in advance that freedom can flourish. And game theory is a great example of it, isn't it? I always use the example of Kabbalat Shabbat service, Friday night, with no prayer book. And the leader has no idea what he or she wants in advance, and says 2 words and then doesn't know what to say next. The 2 words is, Shabbat Shalom. Do your own thing. I'll come back to you in a half an hour. You have no idea what to do. This is prayer? All right. God, thank you for my booby. Thank you for the food. Yeah, I said that last week. A prayer book is a rule book in a certain way in which there's a lot of freedom. When I turn to page 32, I am free to pick whichever reading on that page I want, and you're free to pay full attention or, God forbid, be inattentive. But it's the rules, what's determined, that makes freedom possible. And I think that applies here too. I don't think that God or some force is telling us how to act in a certain way. But certainly there are just to use this language, there are conditions which make certain acts possible and certain acts not, right? I definitely would like to be able to represent a circle in a square. That's not possible. The rules of mathematics don't make that possible. I would like to write a triangle with 4 angles. You're not playing the game anymore. There are rules that determine it, but they liberate, just as the conditions that the author is talking about and on which we've expanded liberate. It's rich, I think, isn't it, Scott? And then I think we have to stop.
Yeah, this is, obviously a very, very sticky question here. Honestly, it's like my mind's died from the question.
Yeah.
Because there are so many factors here that establish that condition. Your actuality to turn it into the potentiality into a kinetic action.
There you go.
But there's also the conditions of the game. There's fortune involved. Fortune as in luck, fortune as in love.
Absolutely, yeah.
And, as Tony said, God. Now,
Yeah.
there's the reason it's sticky is you have the potential to eliminate God here and just consider all of these many other factors.
Yeah.
And which would be a form of idolatry. However, if you go back to the inherent Aristotelian thing of potentiality and he doesn't use this term, but the kinetic form of that, you're talking about a law of the universe, of physics.
Okay.
And the creator there, if you go back to Aristotle and Maimonides, is God. So one of those factors has to be God, or this potential versus kinetic situation would not exist. It's an attribute of the universe, and you could say it's an attribute of God.
That's a very slippery argument. You slipped God in there.
But now he's inevitable
I don't know that he is. I mean, yeah, I think one could think, as Aristotle did, that there's no creation, that the universe is infinite in both directions. And by the way, this is not improbable. We can think of the universe going forward infinitely. Why can't we also think of the universe going back infinitely? And so for Aristotle, there's no creation of the world, but there are conditions. There are parameters. There are a variety of ways of playing the game of life without a transcendent force. I mean, I think it's possible. You know, Maimonides himself, the Guide for the Perplexed, had one basic goal: to solve the issues that perplex a very small set of individuals. The individual who has studied philosophy and understands it, and who has studied religion and understands it, the way in which none of us in this room understand it, and is perplexed as to how they harmonize with each other. This is extremely high-level perplexity. It's not, what should I have for breakfast this morning? Okay? And the nub of the issue is Aristotle and Torah. And Aristotle says the universe is infinite in time, and therefore there was no creation. And no creation means that there are no miracles. There are only the laws of nature. And there's no revelation. And there's no resurrection or life after death. We just have the universe as we have it. And Maimonides says that if Aristotle had a proof of this, he would have to go along with it, because Maimonides feels that the Torah, almost all of it, is susceptible to rational analysis. This is why he spends hundreds of pages in the guide talking about the rationality of each of the 613 commandments. Because Maimonides is trying to show that Judaism is a deeply rational enterprise, which has some assumptions. So I think it's possible to be Aristotelian. Now, it's not just Aristotle, but philosophical thinkers in general, like Spinoza. Not religious philosophers like Kierkegaard or Thomas Aquinas, who is trying very hard to do the same sorts of things, as I understand Aquinas, or Augustine, for that matter, who in some ways is a Platonist. So, yeah, I think one can make the move to God, and I'm not opposed to it, and I think God plays a very important role, but I think we have to be honest, at least I think I have to be honest, to say, you can't slip it in. I told you the story of the philosopher Josiah Royce, who taught for a long time at Harvard. And Josiah Royce's wife said, I know how he thinks. He has his conclusions in hand, and then he writes his philosophy treatise in order to make it come out that way. Right? Already, it's begging the question, already knowing where you want to go. And I think we have to be careful about that if we're trying to analyze something in terms of its terms. If we're making a leap of faith and we're not asking, can I rationally justify it, that's fully legitimate. That is a way of doing it. Fideism is what it's called. Faith leads. What is it? Is it Tertullian who said, I believe in order to understand? I think St. Anselm wrote his proofs for the existence of God in order to show rationally what he already believed. That's very plausible, very reasonable. I'm not arguing for rationalism alone, but I think there is a rational way of doing it as well. I'm not trying to make the case that religion is irrational, but it stands on certain premises which reason need not presuppose. And I think that's another way of doing it. I don't know about you, I am exhausted. So, we're still on humility. We'll come back next week and do it again. Shabbat Shalom. Good. I look forward to it. And thanks for your comments. And Lynn's as well. Isn't it so nice to have you both? Yeah. See you soon.